"I'll be fine," Marcus replied, though the truth was, he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pushing through the pain. The bullet wound in his side hadn't been severe, but it had taken a toll on him, and the adrenaline that had kept him going was starting to wear off. Leah finally turned to face him, her dark eyes meeting his. There was something unreadable in her gaze, something that made Marcus's heart ache. She was carrying so many burdens that he couldn't even begin to understand. "You're not used to this," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mix of sympathy and something else, something more personal. "No," Marcus admitted, his eyes dropping to the floor. "I'm not." Leah let out a soft sigh, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. "I know this isn't your world, Marcus. And I know you didn't ask to be pulled into it. But you're here now and need to be ready for what's coming." Marcus looked up, his gaze locking onto hers. "What do you mean?" Leah hesitated for a moment as if weighing her words. "Nero isn't going to stop. His men are everywhere, and they'll keep coming for us until we're either dead or captured." Marcus's chest tightened at her words, the reality of their situation sinking in. He had known, intellectually, that they were in danger, that they had been in danger since the moment he chose to align himself with Leah and the resistance. But hearing it spoken so plainly and bluntly made it feel more natural. "What do we do?" Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "We fight," Leah said. "We keep moving, keep outsmarting them, and we fight." Marcus's stomach churned at the thought. He had never been a fighter. He had always used his mind and influence to get what he wanted. But now, in this new world Leah had dragged him into, he wasn't sure his usual tactics would be enough. "Do you think we'll make it out of this?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Leah didn't answer right away. She turned back to the window, her gaze again scanning the empty streets. "I don't know," she said finally. "But I have to believe we will. It's the only thing keeping me going." Marcus watched her for a long moment, his heart heavy. He had never met anyone like Leah before. She was a force of nature, unyielding in the face of danger, yet her vulnerability drew him in. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for all the people she had sworn to protect, for the resistance, for the future of Rome. And Marcus realized, at that moment, that he wanted to fight for her. The hours had dragged on, the oppressive silence only broken by the occasional pop and crackle of the fire. Marcus had drifted in and out of a restless sleep, but Leah had remained awake, watchful, and alert. She had grown used to sleepless nights and the constant fear that their enemies could find them at any moment. It was the price she paid for being part of the resistance. But tonight felt different. There was an edge to the quiet, a sense of anticipation that made her skin prickle with unease. She glanced over at Marcus, who was still sleeping fitfully on the couch. His face was pale, his brow furrowed in pain. He had tried to hide it, but Leah knew he was hurting more than he let on. The bullet wound might not have been fatal, but it had weakened him, and they both knew it. Leah's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of footsteps outside. Her body tensed, every muscle going rigid as she reached for the gun tucked into her waistband. The footsteps were faint, barely audible over the crackling of the fire, but they were there. Someone was coming. She moved silently to the door, her hand gripping the gun tightly. Her heart pounded as she listened, her breath shallow and quick. The footsteps grew louder and closer until they stopped just outside the door. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound. No movement. Just the deafening silence of anticipation. And then, a knock. Leah's blood ran cold. She glanced back at Marcus, who had stirred at the sound, his eyes blinking in confusion. "Stay here," Leah whispered, her voice barely audible. Marcus sat up, wincing as the movement pulled at his wound. "What's happening?" Leah didn't answer. She moved toward the door, her body tense, her finger hovering over the trigger of the gun. She reached the door, pressing her ear against the wood, listening for any sign of who, or what, was on the other side. Another knock. Leah's heart raced as she slowly, carefully unlocked the door. She pulled it open just a crack, peering out into the darkness. Standing in the doorway was a man. He was tall, his face partially obscured by the shadows, but Leah recognized him instantly. "Peter?" Leah's voice was filled with disbelief. She hadn't expected to see him here, not after everything that had happened, not after they had been separated in the chaos of the ambush. Peter stepped forward, his face illuminated by the dim light from the fire inside the room. His expression was grim, his eyes hard. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. Leah stepped aside, allowing Peter to enter the room. Marcus watched from the couch, his body tense, as Peter moved inside, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Marcus. "You're lucky to be alive," Peter said, his tone cold. Marcus didn't respond. He knew Peter didn't trust him, had never trusted him, and right now, that distrust was more palpable than ever. "What's going on?" Leah asked, her eyes narrowing as she studied Peter's face. "We've got a problem," Peter said, his voice tight. "Nero's men are closing in. They've been tracking us and know about this safe house." Leah's stomach twisted in fear. "How? How did they find us?" Peter's gaze flicked to Marcus, then back to Leah. "There's a mole. Someone's been feeding Nero information about our movements." Leah's blood ran cold. A mole. The very thought sent a wave of dread crashing over her. She had suspected it, ever since the ambush, ever since Nero's men had been one step ahead of them, but hearing it confirmed was a different kind of terror. "Who?" Leah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Peter shook his head. "We don't know yet. But we need to move. Now." Leah nodded, her mind racing. She turned to Marcus, who was already struggling to his feet, his face pale with pain. He wasn't able to move, but they had no choice. "We'll figure this out later," Leah said, her voice steady. "Right now, we need to get out of here." The streets were dark and deserted, and Leah, Marcus, and Peter moved quickly through the narrow alleyways, staying close to the shadows. Leah's heart pounded in her chest, her senses on high alert as she scanned their surroundings. Every sound and movement in the darkness sent a jolt of fear through her. They had to keep moving. They had to stay ahead of Nero's men. Marcus stumbled beside her, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he struggled to keep up. His body was weak, his wounds slowing him down, but he didn't complain. He just kept going, pushing through the pain with a determination that Leah hadn't expected. They reached the city's edge, where the buildings gave way to the sprawling countryside. It was quiet here, the air heavy with the scent of earth and trees. But the danger was still lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. "We need to keep moving," Peter said, his voice urgent. "We're not safe yet." Leah nodded, glancing at Marcus, leaning heavily against a nearby wall, his face pale and drawn. He wasn't going to make it much farther, not without help. "We'll rest for a moment," Leah said, her voice firm. Peter frowned but didn't argue. He knew as well as Leah did that Marcus couldn't keep going like this. Leah moved to Marcus's side, her hand gently resting on his arm. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft. Marcus nodded, though his expression said otherwise. "I'll be fine," he said. Still, his voice was weak. Leah's heart ached as she looked at him. He had risked everything for her, for them, and now, it was her turn to protect him. "We're going to get through this," Leah said quietly, her eyes locking with his. "I promise." Marcus nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "I know." Chapter 9, The Price of Power. Marcus Vitali stood alone at the edge of the clearing, the sun sinking low on the horizon, casting a blood-orange glow over the landscape. In the distance, the city of Rome lay sprawled like a slumbering giant, its ancient streets winding through history and modernity, wrapped tightly in the iron grip of Nero Ferraro's regime. It was a city built on power, and Marcus had once believed that power was all that mattered. As the sun vanished behind the city's silhouette, Marcus's mind was clouded with a relentless question: was the price of power too steep? His entire life had been built around control, of people, situations, and narratives. As the head of one of the largest media empires in Europe, Marcus had wielded immense influence, shaping public opinion and controlling what people saw and believed. For so long, he had thought this was the only way to survive in a world that rewarded the ruthless and punished the weak. But everything had changed when he met Leah Gregorio. She had challenged him in ways no one else had. Her world was one of resistance, of fighting back against the very power that Marcus had spent his life accumulating. In the beginning, he had seen her as just another piece of the puzzle, a complication in a game he had always been good at playing. But now, standing on the edge of everything he had built, Marcus couldn't help but wonder if he had been playing the wrong game all along. The weight of his choices, like a suffocating cloak, pressed down on him. He had always believed that power came with sacrifices, that it was a price worth paying for control. But he hadn't realized how much it would cost him personally, how much it would take from him, piece by piece, until almost nothing was left. The footsteps behind him broke through his thoughts, and Marcus turned to see Leah approaching. Her face was set in a grim expression, her eyes hard with unwavering determination. Despite the relentless challenges she had faced, she stood tall, a beacon of resilience. And Marcus envied her for that. "You've been quiet," Leah said, her voice low as she came to stand beside him. "What's on your mind?" Marcus let out a slow breath, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I'm just thinking about everything we've lost." Leah glanced at him, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Everything we've lost? What do you mean?" Marcus turned to face her, his expression heavy with the weight of his thoughts. "You've lost people, friends, comrades. I've lost something, too. But it's different." Leah crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. "What exactly have you lost, Marcus?" "Because from where I'm standing, you still have everything." Marcus's jaw tightened at her words. He understood her anger, her resentment. From her perspective, he was still the man who had wielded power over others and lived a life of privilege while she and her people fought for survival. But that wasn't the whole story anymore. "I've lost myself," Marcus said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. Leah's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't respond. Instead, she waited, giving him the space to continue. "For years, I've been living in a world where power was the only thing that mattered," Marcus explained, his gaze shifting back to the horizon. "I built an empire, controlled the narrative, made people believe what I wanted them to believe. But in doing that, I've lost sight of who I am. I don't even know if I ever really knew." Leah remained silent, but Marcus could feel her eyes on him, waiting for him to say more. "When I met you," Marcus continued, "I thought you were just another obstacle, someone who would get in the way of my goal. But now I see that you're the only one who's ever really seen me for who I am." Leah's brow furrowed, her arms dropping to her sides as she stepped closer to him. "What are you saying, Marcus?" "I'm saying that I've been chasing power for so long that I forgot what it meant to be human," Marcus said, his voice filled with regret. "I thought I could control everything, people, situations, even you. But now, I realize that the cost of that power is too high." Leah looked at him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. "Power has a price," she said quietly. "Sometimes, it costs more than we're willing to pay." Marcus nodded, his heart heavy. "I'm starting to see that now." The tension between them seemed to ease for the first time in what felt like days. The weight of their shared experiences, the danger they had faced together, had forged a connection between them, one that Marcus hadn't expected but one he couldn't deny. "You've changed," Leah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I first met you, I never would have imagined you standing here, questioning everything you've built." Marcus let out a bitter laugh. "I never would have imagined it either." Silence fell between them, but it wasn't the same suffocating silence that had filled the air before. It was different, more reflective, more honest. Leah turned her gaze back to the city in the distance, her expression hardening again. "Nero's power comes at a price, too," she said, her voice laced with bitterness. "But the difference is, he doesn't care who pays it. We are just collateral damage as long as he gets what he wants." Marcus's jaw clenched at the mention of Nero. He had been a part of Nero's world for so long, using the regime's influence to further his goals. But now, he saw Nero for what he was, a man who would stop at nothing to maintain control, no matter how many lives he destroyed. "What do we do now?" Marcus asked, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "We fight," Leah said. "We keep fighting until we take him down." Marcus shook his head, a sense of hopelessness washing over him. "But at what cost? How many more people have to die before this is over?" Leah's gaze hardened, her eyes flashing with determination. "As many as it takes. We don't have a choice, Marcus." If we don't stop him, he'll destroy everything. Marcus swallowed hard, the enormity of her words sinking in. He had spent so much of his life focused on self-preservation and protecting his empire that he had never indeed considered what it meant to fight for something bigger than himself. But now, as he stood on the precipice of losing everything, he realized that the only way to survive was to let go of the very thing he had spent his life chasing. Power. Later that night, the safe house was filled with the murmurs of the resistance members who had gathered there. The group was small, too small, Marcus thought, but they were determined. Each of them had lost something to Nero's regime, and now they were willing to risk everything to bring him down. Marcus sat in the corner of the room, watching Lia move through the crowd, speaking with the other leaders in hushed tones. She had become the heart of the resistance and kept them going even when the odds seemed insurmountable. And Marcus couldn't help but admire her for that. But he also knew that admiration wasn't enough. He had to make a choice. Peter Sarto, the head of the resistance, approached Marcus, his expression unreadable. The tension between them hadn't lessened since the ambush, and Marcus knew Peter still didn't trust him. And why would he? Marcus had spent most of his life on the other side of the fight, using his power to benefit himself, while people like Peter had risked everything to stop men like Nero. "You've been quiet," Peter said, his voice low. Marcus looked up at him, his jaw tightening. "I've had a lot to think about." Peter crossed his arms, his gaze hard. "So, have you made up your mind? Are you in this fight or not?" Marcus let out a slow breath, his eyes drifting to Lia, who spoke with another group of resistance members across the room. "I'm in," he said finally, his voice steady. Peter raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "And why should we believe you? You've been on Nero's side for years. What's changed?" Marcus met Peter's gaze, his expression hardening. "I have. I've seen what Nero is capable of, what he'll do to anyone in his way. And I'm not willing to be a part of that anymore." Peter studied him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to read Marcus's soul. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Good. Because we're going to need all the help we can get." Marcus nodded, though the weight of his decision still pressed heavily on his chest. He had chosen his side, but now? Chapter 10, The Revelation. Marcus Vitali stood in the dimly lit control room of his media empire, the cold glow of monitors casting shadows across his face. His hands hovered over the keyboard, his heart pounding in his chest. The world outside was spinning out of control, and he was about to make a decision that could either save or destroy everything he had built. Lia was gone. Captured by Nero's forces in a raid that had come too swiftly, too silently. Marcus had been too late. By the time he had reached the safe house, the walls were stained with the aftermath of the fight, and Lia was missing. Nero had her, and now Marcus was left with a choice that could change the course of everything. His reflection in the monitor was pale, haggard, and haunted by the weight of the decision he was about to make. For so long, Marcus had operated behind the scenes, manipulating the narrative, controlling what the public saw. But now, as Nero tightened his grip on Rome, as Lia's life hung in the balance, Marcus knew that hiding in the shadows was no longer an option. He was about to go live, broadcast to the entire nation, and perhaps beyond, the truth that Nero had spent years burying. It was a risky move. Nero's regime was powerful, ruthless, and if Marcus failed, it would mean not just his life, but the lives of those he cared about. The door to the control room creaked open, and Peter Sarto stepped inside, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "We're running out of time, Vitali," Peter growled, crossing the room in swift strides. "They're going to execute her. Do you understand that?" "I know," Marcus replied, his voice tight with tension. He couldn't look at Peter, couldn't face the accusation in his eyes. He knew that if Lia didn't survive this, Peter would never forgive him. Hell, he wouldn't forgive himself. "They've already moved up the timetable," Peter continued, his voice trembling with frustration. "Nero wants to make a public spectacle of her death, to send a message to the resistance." Marcus's grip on the keyboard tightened, his knuckles white. The thought of Lia in Nero's clutches, of her facing execution, filled him with a kind of rage he had never known. Nero was a monster, and Marcus had been blind to it for far too long. "I'm going live," Marcus said, his voice hardening with determination. I'm going to expose Nero, right here, right now. I'll show the world what he really is. Peter blinked, surprised by the sudden resolve in Marcus's voice. You're going live? He echoed, the disbelief clear in his tone. You're risking everything. Nero's men will come for you the moment you hit that button. I don't care, Marcus shot back, his eyes flashing with anger. I've already lost too much. I'm not going to stand by while Nero executes her. I have to do this. It's the only chance we have. Peter hesitated, his jaw clenched as he considered the plan. He had never trusted